Further accusations and the first resignations as the Yorkshire cricket racism scandal deepens. Former England captain Michael Vaughan is dropped from his BBC radio show after a second player said he used racist language, which he denies.
It's a really difficult day for me. I'm very sad. I've had to resign from a club that I love.
It comes after the chairman and 2 other board members resigned. We'll have the latest with our sports editor, Steve Scott. Also in News at 10 tonight. Justice for 15-year-old Keon Lincoln, who was brutally murdered as a boy aged just 14 years old, who shot him point blank, is convicted. After a week of hearing from global leaders at the climate summit, it was the turn of the young to take to the streets of Glasgow on COP26's Youth Day.
Make action now. Don't just be talking, just make action now.
Described by Sir David Attenborough as nature's water engineers, the largest number of beavers are released in Nottinghamshire in a rewilding project. And thank you, finally, for the music. After a 40-year wait, what do fans make of Abba's new album?
This is ITV News at 10 with Rageh Omaar.
Good evening. The former England cricket captain Michael Vaughan has been a household name since winning the Ashes against Australia in 2005. But he was also a star player for Yorkshire. And tonight his reputation is under the spotlight amidst further allegations in the racism row that's engulfing the club. Speaking to ITV News, a former Pakistani cricketer became the second ex-Yorkshire player to claim that Mr Vaughan had made a racist remark before a county match. Mr Vaughan vehemently denies the claims. Earlier, Yorkshire's chairman resigned over the row, which has left a club steeped in tradition and known around the world in disarray.
Yorkshire is a cricket club imploding, and the resulting shockwaves from Azim Rafiq's racism allegations are getting stronger and reaching wider with every day. Tonight, the BBC dropped the former England captain Michael Vaughan from his radio show on Monday, following claims he told a group of Asian players there were too many of you lot. Vaughan denies saying that. But one of those players, Rana Naverul Hassan, told ITV News today he heard Vaughan use that phrase.
We was playing in 2009 at Nottinghamshire, and I was part of that team. And Mr. Vaughan used that word, there is too many of you. And I think this is the very wrong word for any Asian players. So that is a racism. I feel that.
Michael Vaughan hasn't responded further to the allegations. Azim Rafiq went public with his claims last September, prompting an investigation. A year later, the club confirmed there had been racial harassment, but denied institutional racism. And last month said there had been no conduct that warranted disciplinary action. Yet another major sponsor abandoned Yorkshire today, along with 3 members of the board, over its handling of Rafiq's case. Among those resigning, the chairman, Roger Hutton.
I have enormous sympathy for Azim Rafiq. I've apologised.
He said he apologised to Rafiq and released an explosive parting shot. There has been a constant unwillingness from the executive members of the board and senior management at the club to apologise, he said, and to accept that there was racism. I experienced a culture that refuses to accept change or challenge. Replacing Hutton at the beleaguered county, Lord Kamlesh Patel, who faces quite some job in rebuilding the club's reputation. Yorkshire has already lost sponsors and England matches and faces a protest at Headingley tomorrow from supporters who've lost faith.
Steve, with its big sponsors pulling out and then all of this, just how damaging is all of this becoming for Yorkshire Cricket Club, do you think?
About as damaging as it gets, I think, Rageh, and not just for Yorkshire, for the sport itself. I mean, my understanding is that the total number of current or former players named in this investigation reaches into double figures. Now, either they'll come out and identify themselves, a bit like Michael Vaughan did in the coming days, or they'll be named by Azim Rafiq when he gives evidence to MPs in a couple of weeks' time. But the crisis has spread beyond Yorkshire's borders. The ECB have admitted having very uncomfortable conversations with their current commercial partners. But of course, this is a lot more than about just finance. Cricket's reputation is at stake really here. How do you convince the next generation of British Asians to take up the sport when they see such a serious crisis like this being handled the way it has? What parent would trust their child with, let's say, the Yorkshire county cricket system in the current climate? And then the rest of the world must be looking on in disbelief too, especially the cricket-loving nations like India and Pakistan, as you well know, because they see Headingley as this great cricketing cathedral. I think Lord Patel's appointment will help, but as things stand, he's going to have to work with the two executive directors who don't look like they're going anywhere. And until they do, I fear that not many people will believe the club is genuinely repentant or committed to wholesale change.
Sorry, I think they'll run. Thank you very much indeed, Steve. Now, the murder of a 15-year-old schoolboy in the street outside his home in Birmingham in January was extreme and shocking in its senseless, ruthless violence. Slashed and stabbed with knives as he tried to run away, Keon Lincoln was then finally shot at close range by a 14-year-old boy standing over him with a gun. 4 youths were convicted of his murder yesterday, but today a fifth, who supplied their knives, was found guilty of manslaughter. It only adds to the horror, with police saying even now, at the end of the trial, that they don't know why this brutal crime was carried out.
Keon Lincoln, full of life, full of energy, with a beaming smile, according to his family, was just 15 when he was shot and stabbed metres from his front door in Birmingham. This, one of his killers, Michael Oguchukwu, caught on CCTV armed with the knife he stabbed Keon with just seconds later. One of a group of teenagers who murdered him, the youngest of whom was the gunman at just 14. Keon's mother, Charmaine, left grieving her son, a child killed at the hands of children.
We heard what happened, heard the gunshots, and my first instinct was, where's my son? Those are the first words I said, where's my son?
The group drove to Keon's house in this stolen white car, armed with knives and a loaded gun. He'd been standing on the street. This the moment the car stopped and the attack began, when Keon was chased, stabbed before being shot dead. Police later found the car abandoned. Inside the footwell, one of the knives used in the attack that lasted just 40 seconds. 2 of the killers were caught on CCTV in the aftermath. They, 18-year-old Tarjim Breckenridge and Michael Oguchukwu, were found guilty of murder, alongside a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old who can't be named because of their age. A fifth teenager, 18-year-old Kieran Donaldson, who supplied the weapons, was found guilty of manslaughter.
It has been extremely difficult knowing that those responsible for such a terrible act were only very young themselves. Why would they pick up such, deadly weapons, including a firearm, and decide to use it against another individual?
Some believe Keon was the victim of a post-Code War, but police say they still don't know exactly why he was targeted. Another young life lost in a senseless killing. Sejal Karia, News at 10.
All this week, world leaders at the COP26 summit in Glasgow have been emphasising the urgency of tackling the climate change crisis. Well, today, Youth Day at the summit, their efforts were ridiculed by the activist Greta Thunberg. Thousands of young people, many of them school pupils on strike, had marched through Glasgow's streets. Ms Thunberg then told the demonstrators that COP26 is a greenwash festival, a failure, she called it, full of empty words and promises.
This movement started with a lone 15-year-old girl striking outside her school every Friday. Today, Greta Thunberg was joined by 15,000 following in her footsteps through Glasgow.
When I watched I Am Greta, I just felt so inspired.
We're trying to make up for lost time, really.
Make up for lost time? You don't see this as skipping school to be here today?
No, absolutely not, because we are the future generation and they're all going to have to live with the effects of it.
Just make action now. We want action. We want justice. We want equality.
More action. And we want it now.
More action.
How old are you?
11 years old.
Is this your first protest?
Yes.
These Fridays for Future marches are now a global phenomenon. And in the host city of COP26, children, adults, and even four-legged campaigners marched for miles to hear their de facto leader speak.
Some people say that we are being too radical, believing that our civilization as we know it can survive a 2.7 degree or a 3 degree hotter world, on the other hand, is not only extremely radical, it's pure madness.
Her assessment of COP's success in dealing with the climate crisis was utterly damning.
And COP26 has been named the most exclusionary COP ever. This is no longer a climate conference. This is now a global North greenwash festival. A 2-week-long celebration of business as usual and blah, blah, blah.
She wasn't asked to speak to world leaders at this COP, but Greta Thunberg proved to the politicians she doesn't need an invitation to be heard.
I think Greta's doing a lot. She's only 19, I think, and she's made a lot of differences. A lot of people are listening to her.
It was just incredible knowing all the things that she's done for the planet, and just thinking that I've actually got to see her in person is just incredible.
World leaders already left Glasgow COP, but they aren't the audience anymore. Because this green revolution, led predominantly by young women, isn't here to ask for change, they're here to start it. Peter Smith, News at 10, Glasgow.
Carrying on the climate change theme, the quality of air that people breathe is one sure indicator of why controlling the burning of fossil fuels is so vital. And if you think it's bad in cities here, pity the inhabitants of Delhi, which currently has by far the world's worst air pollution. The Air Quality Index measures the amount of dangerous particles in the atmosphere and ranges from 0 to 300 plus, the worst. In Manchester this afternoon, the Air Quality Index stood at 76, which is classified as moderate. We saw earlier in the week how coal is still fueling pollution in Beijing. Well, today the index there worsened to 213, or very unhealthy. But in Delhi this morning, ITV News measured the air quality for ourselves, and it was much worse. More than twice as bad, in fact, at a staggering 502. That is officially hazardous, a classification you might think is an understatement after a doctor there told us the lungs of newborn babies are as if they'd smoked 20 cigarettes.
This morning, Delhi woke up to another deadly blanket of smog. A toxic combination of fumes which far too regularly choke its air and its people. It can be like this for days, and wearing a mask does little to mitigate the health damage. The pollution was particularly bad today, following last night's Diwali celebrations.
It's absolutely bad, there is no doubt in that. And I think that people should be more concerned about their health, because the pandemic has also bring us that health should be our more concern right now.
It's like full of pollution today. We even can't see the sunlight and sun, we even can't see sun.
Despite a government ban on firecrackers, they were still seen, heard and smelt across the capital. After the terrible COVID losses the country suffered this year, many felt an added importance to this Hindu festival, celebrating light and new beginnings. But it's not a single celebration that is killing more than 1 million Indians every year. It is the lethal gases coming from diesel generators, cars and coal plants. This is one of 2 smog towers which recently began operating in Delhi, claiming to filter out 80% of the harmful matter. They appear not quite up to the task.
Modi, Prime Minister of India.
At the COP26 this week, Prime Minister Modi outlined his climate change targets, claiming India is the only major economy delivering on its promises.
हर संभव efforts कर रहे हैं, परिश्रम कर रहे हैं, और परिणाम लाकर दिखा रहे हैं.
Dr. Kumar doesn't recognise the success story shared by the Prime Minister. His chest patients used to be primarily smokers. Now he treats children with pollution-congested lungs.
So today, if my AQI is 400 plus and PM 2.5 is say 600 or so, which is it's likely to be, divided by 22 and you get the number of cigarettes it's equal to. So every child born in the city of Delhi today will breathe 20 plus cigarettes on the first day of his or her life.
This poisonous pollution is contributing to the warming of our planet. And the adults in this populated nation might not live to see India hit its emissions-free target. Debbie Edward, News at 10.
A senior cabinet figure admitted to us today that mistakes had been made in the way Owen Paterson's disciplinary case was handled. But the government might have to think again if it was hoping the sleaze row would now just fade away after Mr Paterson's resignation. Labour thinks it smells a rat over whether Boris Johnson properly declared his recent holiday in Marbella and now wants that investigated too.
A week when the spectre of sleaze in politics returned, ending the career of the Tory MP for North Shropshire. Few here thought that he had any choice but to quit.
I feel he really has never had the interests of his constituents at heart, and I'm delighted that he's going.
Just overwhelming sort of leaps of joy from me and my family, because it can't be allowed to happen. It's not responsible, it's not fair.
Seems like he's been through a hard time. Being an MP must be quite hard anyway.
Hard, certainly, for many of his colleagues. Told to vote to change the system to save Owen Paterson from being suspended from Parliament, then watching the government perform a U-turn. One minister today admitted the way it had all been handled was wrong.
So I do regret the mistake. I'd much prefer a leader that changes his mind within 24 hours and says, actually, you know what? Upon reflection, I think we got that wrong. Let's get it right. Then one that would just plough on regardless.
Are the Tories the party of sleaze, Prime Minister?
But how Boris Johnson ever thought it was right to pass a law which would directly benefit a political friend has caused serious disquiet on the backbenches. The man who was Chief of Staff to his predecessor says it also raises questions about the advice he's getting.
I think MPs will be feeling, well, who has the Prime Minister got around him that if his antenna are off, if his judgment is off and he's doing something that is clearly going to not work, has he got people around him that say to him, Prime Minister, you should not do this?
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister's judgment in spending a recent holiday in Marbella as a guest at a Tory peer's villa is also under scrutiny. Number 10 insists, as it was hospitality from another minister, Lord Goldsmith, also a personal friend, it was above board. Labour want an inquiry.
I don't want Boris Johnson doing something because his mates give him the money for a luxury holiday. I want Boris Johnson to do something because it's in the best interest of our country and in the best interests of the people that we're there to represent. And if he's getting money and he's getting gifts that he's not declaring, then that's very serious.
Labour now say the whole system at Westminster needs reform. In particular, they want MPs to be banned from any kind of lobbying. Libby Vina, News at 10, Westminster.
There are growing calls for a public inquiry into how the double murderer David Fuller was able to carry out scores of sexual assaults on corpses at the mortuaries where he worked. It's thought Fuller attacked at least 78 bodies over more than a decade whilst working as an electrician. Around 80 people have called for a police helpline to be set up for concerned families after it emerged detectives may not have identified all of his mortuary victims. 2 years ago, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Tonight, a year after launching a war against rebels in the northern province of Tigray, he stands on the brink of being forced out of office with rebel forces only 200 miles from the capital, Addis Ababa. It is a spectacular fall for a man credited with helping transforming Ethiopia from a country of poverty and hunger to Africa's fastest growing economy. The UN has tonight called for an end to hostilities, but with fears growing of a full-scale civil war, the president of Zambia told me that if that happens, it will fast become a problem for the world and not just Africa. Ethiopia's capital has the semblance of calm, but Addis Ababa is a city fearing this is the prelude to a storm which is gathering on its doorstep. It's one of Africa's most important cities, home to the headquarters of the UN and the African Union. Yet its 6 million residents have been told to arm themselves by the government in a last-ditch defense against Tigrayan rebels who are just 200 miles away.
እውነቱን ለመናገር ኢትዮጵያ ብታሸንፍ ይሻለኛል። የድርድር ጊዜም አይመስለኝም። ብዙ ሰው
1 year ago, the Ethiopian government's million-strong army launched an offensive against rebels in Tigray in a war in which all sides have been accused of war crimes. But Ethiopia's army collapsed and Tigray's rebels are now threatening to take the capital by force, causing global concern. I spoke with the president of Zambia, who is visiting London. What do you think will be the consequences for the whole region and Africa if Ethiopia were to be plunged into a full-scale civil war?
The Ethiopian situation is not an Ethiopian situation per se. It's a situation afflicting all of us and the globe. Some will be injured and be maimed permanently, impairing their ability to any livelihood to look after themselves, to look after their families.
Just 2 years ago, Ethiopia's Prime Minister was the darling of the international community, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his reforms. Now he stands on the brink of defeat and exile. It's left US diplomats stunned and scrambling to avoid a battle for the capital.
The Horn of Africa is a critically important region, and it looked like it was going from a very troubled region to one of great promise. This is what drives me absolutely crazy, is it is a needless war. Every rape, every murder, every farmer left without being able to plant his field is an absolute unnecessary tragedy.
Tens of thousands have already fled this war, but this is the tip of what could be a far bigger crisis. With a population of 110 million, 5 times the size of Syria, a full-scale civil war in Ethiopia could easily become the biggest global humanitarian crisis in decades. Despite the fact that COVID infections across the UK are still at or at best near record levels, some experts are cautiously hoping that the pandemic may have passed its latest peak. Latest government figures suggest that the numbers of new cases has decreased slightly over the past fortnight, but infection rates remain stubbornly high among school children from year 12 upwards. We visited a school in Cambridgeshire where extra precautions are being taken.
This is the reality now for these school children. Cleaning their desks before they leave the lesson, and for some, even wearing masks during it. But this is pretty unique. Cambridgeshire County Council's asked all its schools to reintroduce face masks in communal areas because of high levels of COVID, something pupils are pleased about.
You feel a bit safer, do you, wearing it?
Yeah, especially in the high-trafficked areas like the canteen and the corridors. You feel a lot safer when everyone's passing past each other.
For me personally, it's okay. I don't really mind it because it just means that we can get back to normal sooner.
More than half of all the cases in this area are amongst school-aged children, but vaccination teams haven't even visited Sawston Village College yet, and the principal is frustrated at how little is being done to support them.
I'm not sure the measures alone are going to help us with mitigating transmission. And we're doing everything that we can, that we've been asked to do, and our pupils have been great. It's just that I think there are possibly some more measures, and certainly at a national level, some more support that could help us stopping it ripping through schools.
No school in this country has been immune to COVID. In the first half of this term, this school had nearly 20% of its kids off with the virus at some point. And yes, mask wearing in the corridors will have some sort of effect, but rates among school-aged children are still very high. And since masks are not compulsory in schools in England, most rely on good ventilation. But despite this public health campaign promoting it, one government advisor admits it should be combined with other measures.
The highest risk of exposure is probably when you're very close to somebody, and ventilation really doesn't tackle that very well.
But there are really no other measures in schools, are there, at the moment, other than ventilation?
There are very few measures in schools, that's right, and it is a very challenging environment for schools.
Rates in children do appear to be finally falling, but infections are still near record levels. It begs the question whether masks in schools could help bring those down even further. Emily Morgan, News at 10 in Cambridgeshire.
Now, a few days ago at the COP26 summit, we heard Sir David Attenborough single out the role of beavers in the rewilding projects, which he claims can help fight climate change. He said, as our natural water engineers, beavers can play a vital part in bringing back important wildlife habitats. Today, that process was given a big boost, with the largest group of beavers ever to be released into the wild in England.
These small steps mark a big moment. Beavers are back in Nottinghamshire for the first time in 400 years. This one has come all the way from Scotland, and he looks right at home.
You can see the habitat here. It's absolutely stunning. This is where beavers do really well, and it's where they should be.
But it's not just about what's good for the beavers.
Yeah, so you can see that, you know, the scrub has grown along some of our shorelines here. And we cut it back and it grows again, and the beavers will just be able to be here munching it all the time for us. They'll also create new pools and little ponds and channels, all of which will benefit other species like amphibians, frogs and toads, and it'll also improve habitat for water voles.
7 beavers were released here today, including a mum and 4 kits. They are part of an ongoing experiment aimed at reintroducing the species across Britain. Since arriving on Exmoor 2 years ago, beavers have been helping to control flooding by building a dam. But in Scotland, where around 1,000 live in the wild, not everyone is impressed. Some farmers blame them for causing damage to their land, and they can be killed by anyone with a licence. But at this wildlife trust, they argue beavers have a crucial part to play in combating climate change.
This is allowing nature to recover at scale. We've lost a huge amount of our wild places and our wildlife over the last 100 years, and we need to get into a place where nature is able to recover. And that's what this vision is all about for the Idle Valley Nature Reserve.
Well, these two have scarpered pretty quickly, but over the next few months and years, they'll be being very closely watched. There'll be 50 cameras dotted around this huge enclosure, monitoring how well they adapt to their new environment. Experts here hope this will help them show the benefits of bringing beavers back in greater numbers. Chloe Keedy, News at 10, Nottinghamshire.
And finally, their message on Instagram seemed to contain the hopes and fears of tens of millions of fans across the world, signed by those famous Abba names, Agnetha, Bjorn, Benny and, of course, Anni-Frid. It simply said, thanks for waiting. The Swedish supergroup's comeback studio album Voyage was released today, but the anticipation has been building up for over 40 years. So, does Abba's inimitable magic survive the passage of time?
40 years ago, they said they were taking a short break. Now in their 70s, they've popped back to record one of the most anticipated releases of recent times. What started out as a get-together in the studio to record 2 songs became Voyage, an album of 10 new ABBA tracks.
The opportunity to write new music for ABBA and to record it, and then coming out of the studio and sort of, yeah, I like the result. And I speak to Frid and Agnetha, and I know they're extremely happy.
They're not the only ones. ABBA tribute bands like Fabba Girls at last have some new material to play with.
But I remind myself of who we are.
And they're already practicing the new songs for their repertoire.
At last, we've got loads of new songs to learn, and we're very excited about that.
ABBA have not disappointed you?
No, not at all. I love the way they've kept everything in the proper ABBA vein, the way I think it should be. I hope everyone loves the album.
Student Sharnika is doing her thesis on ABBA fans like her. She now needs to write another chapter. This is going to be the last album.
It's really nice closure for the fans today to get that final album and to know it's the final album and to just be able to hear ABBA in all their glory.
Even if Adele beats them to the Christmas #1, the band still have their digital avatar show next year. Abba's voyage continues. Nina Nanar, News at 10.
It does indeed continue. And that's all for now. News at 10 will be back on Monday. From me and the rest of the team, a very good night.